Lisbon has become the true center of the global spice trade. This pepper is worth more than gold, my lord. On this day, Vasco da Gama's fleet set sail from Lisbon. In late 1497, a violent storm battered the fleet. Vasco da Gama pushed forward into the unknown. In November 1497, Vasco da Gama faced the ultimate test: to round the treacherous Cape of Good Hope and open the way to India. In 1498, the fleet began its long return. Ahead lay thousands of miles of perilous open sea. Secure the cargo and brace for the open sea. Years later, Vasco da Gama returned, commanding a massive and heavily armed fleet, ready to conquer the Indian Ocean.
Fire all cannons!
In the early 16th century, a new power arrived on these shores. Driven by the global demand for spices, fortified trading posts began to rise. In 1524, Vasco da Gama returned to India. Now Viceroy, the legendary explorer, faced his final journey.
On this 15th century map, the Indian Ocean was the center of global wealth, trading spices and silks. This wealth funneled overland through the Middle East and to Venice, giving Arab and Venetian merchants an impenetrable monopoly, leaving Portugal geographically locked out and facing exorbitant markups. For the Portuguese crown, reaching Asian wealth was an existential economic necessity. They were going broke, and they needed a way around the Venetians to survive. King John II proposed a radical solution: bypass the Mediterranean entirely. He wanted to sail south, navigate all the way around the unexplored bottom tip of the African continent, and enter the Indian Ocean from the back door. This was a terrifying proposition. For decades, European sailors tried to map Africa's western coast. Thousands of men had died in shipwrecks or vanished into the unknown, trying to find exactly where the continent ended. In 1497, a minor nobleman named Vasco da Gama was launched into that abyss. He sailed out of Lisbon with just 4 ships and 170 men, heading straight into the most violent open ocean on the planet. We can see the intense difficulty of the journey by looking at the tools they relied on, like this brass astrolabe. Surviving required complex celestial navigation and precise mathematical measurements using era-specific instruments like this to avoid sailing off course into oblivion. Da Gama's voyage was a high-stakes strategic gamble to find a physical path around Africa. This would completely dismantle the geographic advantage that kept Venice rich and Portugal poor for centuries. This animated map shows the sheer physical extreme of da Gama's outward voyage. To catch the westerly winds, he steered away from the coast and sailed deep into the South Atlantic. His men sailed more than 10,000 kilometers of open water without seeing land. Against all odds, the physical navigation worked. In May 1498, the fleet made landfall in Kozhikode, India. But the diplomatic mission collapsed immediately. Da Gama offered the local ruler trivial gifts of honey, oil, and cheap cloth. The highly advanced Indian and Arab merchants mocked him, as they were accustomed to trading in solid gold and fine silk. Realizing his total lack of leverage, Da Gama panicked. He was refused permission to leave a trading post behind, so he retaliated by kidnapping a group of local fishermen by force and fleeing the harbor. The return journey was a brutal ordeal. Da Gama ignored local warnings and sailed directly against the monsoon winds. The crossing took over 90 days, and a severe outbreak of scurvy wiped out roughly half of his entire crew. Geographically, he had proven the maritime route existed. Economically, the expedition was a total disaster. He secured exactly 0 trade agreements. When the survivors limped back to Lisbon, the Portuguese crown faced a stark realization. They did not have the high-value goods required to compete in a fair, open market. To get the spices, they had to change the rules of the trade entirely. 3 years later, in 1502, Vasco da Gama returned to India. He didn't bring honey or cloth this time. He arrived with a heavily armed armada of 15 warships and 800 soldiers. This was the invention of gunboat diplomacy, using overwhelming naval firepower to force economic compliance from a weaker or unwilling trading partner. Da Gama's tactics were calculated acts of terror. Off the coast of India, he intercepted a ship carrying Muslim pilgrims to Mecca. He locked over 400 civilian men, women, and children inside the hull and burned them alive, simply to send a message to the local merchant networks. He then anchored off the unfortified city of Kozhikode and bombarded it for nearly 2 days. When the local ruler sent an envoy to negotiate, Da Gama had the man's lips and ears cut off and replaced them with dog's ears to humiliate the king. Europe did not politely join the ancient Asian trade network. They violently hijacked it. They replaced centuries of economic competition with sheer naval warfare. Those violent tactics worked perfectly. Portugal seized control of the spice flow, and the wealth pouring into Lisbon was staggering. You can see it in the sheer scale of the Geronimus monastery, funded almost entirely by a direct tax on the new Indian Ocean trade. Da Gama himself extracted an immense personal fortune. King Manuel rewarded him with a massive hereditary pension, the noble title of Count, and eventually appointed him the Viceroy of India. Today, history has largely sanitized his legacy. He rests under this serene carved stone effigy, remembered widely as a brave national hero, rather than a pirate who mutilated his rivals for profit. Da Gama's success sent a clear, terrifying message to the rest of the world. He proved that extreme violence and extortion were highly profitable, laying down the blueprint for the European explorers who would follow him. This single maritime route shifted the global balance of power. The Mediterranean was bypassed, and the center of global wealth began its multi-century move toward the nations bordering the Atlantic. Look at this map of colonial expansion. Portugal, followed by the Dutch, the British, and the French, rapidly replicated this militarized model. They built armed outposts down the coast of Africa and across Asia, mirroring the exact path Da Gama had forcibly cracked open. The Age of Discovery was a dual reality. It produced breathtaking feats of human navigation, but it simultaneously ignited the fuse for systemic maritime colonization. This violent maritime bypass established the strategic template for the next 3 centuries. It demonstrated that a naval monopoly could dictate the flow of global wealth and provide the foundation for the expansion of European empires.
To really get a grip on this, we have to look at their actual mission statement. When Da Gama's exhausted crew finally hit the shores of India in May of 1498, the local authorities basically asked, "What are you doing here?" Their response? "In search of Christians and spices." That one little sentence perfectly captures the dual mandate of the Portuguese crown. You see, this wasn't just a simple business trip. Operating under the doctrine of discovery, they were fueled by this intense religious desire to find lost Christian kingdoms, paired with a fiercely competitive drive to just completely upend Muslim dominance in the Indian Ocean trade networks. And that brings us to the core question of today's explainer. How exactly does a simple search for spices spark an entire age of global imperialism? It's a fascinating shift, right? What starts off as this wildly dangerous exploration into the total unknown rapidly turns into a ruthless campaign to enforce a trade monopoly. To understand how we get from point A to point B, we've got to set the stage and look at the geopolitical chessboard of the late 15th century.
At the time, the highly profitable spice trade flowing from Asia to Europe was practically on lockdown by the Republic of Venice. They relied on an overland route, moving goods through Arab ports all across the Arabian Peninsula. It worked well, but it was land-based and locked up tight. Now, over in Portugal, King John II desperately needed cash to fill up his royal treasury, and he knew that tapping directly into the spice trade was the ultimate prize. But to bypass Venice, the Portuguese had to attempt the impossible, mapping out a completely unknown, incredibly dangerous, ocean-based route all the way around the southern tip of Africa.
Just the logistics of this first voyage alone were an absolutely mind-blowing nautical feat. Da Gama set sail from Lisbon in July 1497 with 4 ships and about 170 men. By November, they managed around the Cape of Good Hope, sailing over 10,000 kilometers of open ocean without even seeing land. To put that into perspective, that was the longest journey without making landfall ever recorded up to that point in history. Finally, by April 1498, they hit Malindi in modern-day Kenya, managed to hire a pilot who actually understood the complex monsoon winds, and boom, in May 1498, they landed in India.
But here's where things get kind of wild. For all their brilliant navigation skills, they were completely out of their depth culturally. Case in point, a massive diplomatic blunder right out of the gate. Da Gama wanders into a Hindu temple in Kozhikode, spots a statue of the goddess Parvati, and, thinking he'd finally found those long-lost Christians he was hunting for, drops to his knees in praise, totally convinced it was the Virgin Mary. It's a striking detail that just proves how little these European explorers actually understood about the incredibly diverse world they had just crashed into.
And this sheer lack of preparation became painfully obvious when it was time to talk business. Da Gama tries to offer gifts to the local ruler, the Zamarin. What does he bring? Some scarlet cloth, 6 hats, coral, sugar, oil, and a cask of honey. I mean, think about it. This is a massively wealthy, thriving trade hub that deals in gold and silver every single day, and Da Gama hands over some hats and honey. It was practically insulting. In fact, the gifts were so laughably cheap that local Muslim merchants figured Da Gama wasn't even a real royal ambassador. They thought he was just a run-of-the-mill pirate.
Unsurprisingly, unable to get a proper commercial treaty, he decided to cut his losses and head home. But then, he makes a near-fatal mistake. He totally ignores local advice about the monsoon winds. On the trip over, sailing with the summer monsoon, the ocean crossing only took them 23 days. Super fast. But heading back, sailing directly against those brutal winter monsoon winds, it took an agonizing 90 days.
The human toll of that return crossing was just visceral. Scurvy absolutely tore through the crew. More than half of the men who had initially left Lisbon died. The situation got so desperate that, without enough guys left standing to even manage the fleet, Da Gama was forced to scuttle, or intentionally sink, one of his own vessels, the San Rafael, off the coast of East Africa. Yet despite all this horrifying suffering and the failure to even secure a treaty, when the battered survivors limped back into Lisbon in the late summer of 1499, they were treated like absolute heroes. Why? Because the small amount of spices they did manage to bring back proved this new ocean route was going to be insanely profitable.
And this is the turning point that changes everything. Fast forward to 1502. Da Gama heads back to India, this time commanding the 4th India Armada. But make no mistake, this wasn't an exploratory mission anymore. Following some clashes between Portuguese traders and local guilds, Da Gama rolls in with a heavily armed fleet of 15 ships and 800 men. The mission this time? Pure revenge against the Zamarin, and using brute force to secure a Portuguese spice monopoly.
To really grasp how ruthless this monopoly enforcement was, we have to look at what happened to the Murimalayam. This was a ship traveling from Kozhikode to Mecca. Da Gama intercepted it and completely looted it. On board were over 400 Muslim pilgrims, including about 50 women. The passengers literally offered him vast wealth just to spare their lives. But according to eyewitness accounts from his own expedition, Da Gama locked everyone inside and burned the ship, killing all 400 people on board.
The devastation only escalated when the fleet finally reached Kozhikode. Da Gama demanded the local ruler expel all Muslims from the city. When the ruler refused, the Portuguese fleet bombarded the unfortified city from the sea for nearly 2 straight days, and his tactics relied on extreme physical terror. When the Zamarins sent a high priest out to negotiate, Da Gama had the man's lips and ears cut off, sewed dog's ears onto his head, and sent him back. They also intercepted local rice boats, deliberately severing the hands, noses, and ears of the captive crews.
By unleashing this horrific level of terror, Da Gama actually succeeded in bringing regional trade to a dead stop, loaded his ships with spices from rival kingdoms, and sailed back to Portugal in 1503. But here is the ironic twist. Despite delivering the goods, his inability to completely crush the Zamarin into submission, combined with his incredibly volatile temper, actually cost him royal favor. For the next 2 decades, the so-called Admiral of the Seas of Arabia, Persia, and India was effectively benched, living a quiet life totally sidelined from Indian affairs by the crown.
It wasn't until 1524, under the new king, John III, that he was finally called back into the game. The Portuguese colonial government in India had grown completely corrupt and incompetent, so they sent Da Gama to clean house, handing him the ultimate title, Viceroy. On the voyage over, something wild happened. The fleet was hit by a massive submarine earthquake. The water physically began to boil, violently rocking the ships. But Da Gama, ever the intimidating commander, uses this terrifying moment to pump up his panicked crew, shouting, "Friends, rejoice and be happy, for even the sea trembles before us." He makes it to India in September 1524 and immediately gets to work firing corrupt officials. But his big, triumphant return as viceroy? It was incredibly short-lived. Literally just 3 months after he arrived, Da Gama contracted malaria.
After a life defined by surviving the most treacherous oceans on Earth, his story comes to a sudden, quiet end. He died in the city of Cochin on Christmas Eve, 1524.
Which brings us to his incredibly complicated historical footprint. Back in Europe, especially in Portugal, da Gama was elevated to mythic status. He was immortalized as the ultimate hero of the Age of Discovery, most famously in the 1572 epic poem Os Lusíadas. But the reality on the ground, especially on the Malabar coast of India, is an entirely different story. There, he is not remembered as some noble pioneer. He is remembered as a maritime warlord, a man whose extreme atrocities left deep, permanent scars on the entire region.
So, all of this leaves us with a pretty stark question. You literally cannot deny that Vasco da Gama's sea route fundamentally reshaped the global economy and permanently shifted the course of world history. It changed everything. But we have to ask ourselves, at what human cost? It's a heavy reminder that the global maps we still rely on today were quite literally drawn with profound violence. It's a dual legacy we are still trying to unpack centuries later. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the narratives and keep exploring the complex truths behind the history we thought we knew.